Throughout the first 3 ages of Middle-earth, the Free Peoples have always been faced with a great enemy. In the first age, there was Morgoth. In the second age, there was Sauron. And although Sauron's malice did linger all the way up to the destruction of the One Ring, I would argue that he was not the great enemy of the Third Age. Obviously, Sauron was the Dark Lord of Mordor, and the Servants of Shadow were his servants. But by the Third Age, Sauron's days as an active aggressor were behind him. The great enemy of the Third Age, at least from the perspective of the Dúnedain and the Elves, was a mysterious new threat that arose in the frozen lands of Iron. He was the Witch-king of Angmar, the King Breaker. Alla Tulia Meldonia Ahara Mariese. My name is Rainbow Dave, and welcome to another Tolkien lore video. So, I feel that when compared to Morgoth and Sauron, it is very easy to diminish the Witch King's influence over Middle-earth. After all, he's not a Valar, he's not a Maya. The Witch King is simply a man. Or at least he used to be. Unlike both Morgoth and Sauron, the Witch King has no ambition to rule or to dominate for his own sake. He is simply a slave to his master. He is a wraith bound to a ring. And yet, the Witch King is single-handedly responsible for not only breaking the line of the kings of Gondor, but he also effectively wiped the lost kingdom of Arnor from the map. Throughout the Third Age, I would argue that there was no greater threat to the Free Peoples. There was no deadlier enemy. So, in order to properly understand what the Witch King did and why he's so significant, we need to take a look at the 2 kingdoms of the Dúnedain. So, I'm sure every one of you here will know about Gondor, the land of stone that was founded by Isildur and his brother after the downfall of Númenor. However, in the beginning, Gondor was simply the other kingdom of the Dúnedain, the lesser kingdom. Far to the north lay the kingdom of Isildur's father, the great kingdom of Arnor, which was known colloquially as the King's Land. It was ruled by Elendil, and back in the day, Arnor was the greatest kingdom of men ever to exist in Middle-earth. In fact, the King of Arnor was also the High King of all of the Dúnedain, and his rule extended over both Arnor and Gondor. But, as I guess we all know, Elendil didn't last too long in Middle-earth. After the War of the Last Alliance, both Elendil and Isildur's brother had been slain, and 2 years later, Isildur joined them in death. So, right at the beginning of the Third Age, the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor split, and effectively, they went their own separate ways. Arnor was ruled by the sons of Isildur, and Gondor was ruled by the sons of his late brother. And it would take 3,009 years for the 2 kingdoms to be reunited again under one king. That king is, of course, Aragorn. But over the next few thousand years, there was another king who changed the course of both kingdoms. So, referring to the Witch King as a king is actually kind of a little bit misleading. We know next to nothing about the character's origins, except that he was the chief of the Nazgul. But in the Silmarillion, Tolkien does tell us that 3 of the Nazgul were once great lords of Númenorian race. Now, we can't say for certain that the Witch King was one of these 3, but it does seem kinda likely, as he is indeed the mightiest of the Nazgul. And this, of course, would mean that he is not actually a king at all. All the Númenorian kings are accounted for, and not one of them was given a Ring of Power. And so, during the rise of the Ringwraiths in the Second Age, their leader was simply known as the Lord of the Nazgul. And when Sauron fell in the War of the Last Alliance, the Nazgul disappeared with him, at least for a while. Now, when we talk about the Witch King, I guess we all kind of take it for granted that he is the Lord of the Nazgul. Like, we all know that he is the captain of Sauron's mightiest servants. But when he first arose in Angmar, this was not common knowledge. The Nazgul had been gone for over 1,000 years at that point, and so the men of Arnor knew only that he was some kind of mysterious evil who had emerged from the frozen lands of Angmar. So they called him the Witch-king of Angmar, and the name pretty much stuck. Now, if there is one thing that can be said about the Witch-king, it's that the dude is patient. Despite the fact that he arrived in Angmar in the year 1300 of the Third Age, it was another 109 years before he actually declared war against Arnor. And in that century, he established his capital at Carn Dûm, and he summoned an army of orcs and evil men into his service. And then he waited. You see, as is so often the case, the men of Arnor turned out to be the cause of their own undoing. Because only 982 years after its founding, Arnor was broken and divided by internal conflict among the 10th king's 3 sons. So the once proud and mighty nation of Elendil was now split into 3 rival lordships. The first of these lordships is called Arthedain, which was ruled by the old king's eldest son. The second lordship was called Cardolan, and the third was called Rhudaur. And for hundreds of years, these 3 territories fought amongst each other. Now, for the heirs of Isildur, this was a disaster, but for the Witch King, this was exactly what he had been waiting for. So, in the year 1409, the Witch King perceived that the time had come to destroy Arnor entirely. Now, the Witch King's first move was to infiltrate the hearts and minds of his enemies, and to turn the enemies of his enemies into allies. You see, in Arthedain, the blood of the Dúnedain still ran thick, and in Cardolan, a memory still persisted of the old days when Arnor was united. But in Rhudaur, there was no such nostalgia. The descendants of Isildur had long since died out in Rhudaur, and the territory was now ruled not by Dúnedain, but by wild hillmen. And with a secret alliance from Angmar, these hillmen took power. Now, I do think it's important to note that the Witch King didn't invade Rhudaur through, conquest. Instead, the hillmen were enticed into doing the Witch King's work on his behalf. And he simply annexed the territory once its local population had risen up against the Dúnedain and slaughtered those who remained. And so, with Rhudaur under the Witch King's dominion, the end of Arnor had officially begun. But all was not yet lost. You see, the Lord of Arthedain was a man called Argeleb, and Argeleb was one of the few descendants of Isildur who still ruled in Arnor. So, by the right of his bloodline, Argeleb sought to reunite the 3 territories and to return Arnor to its glory days. Now, Cardolan agreed, and although they kept their own princes, throughout Arthedain and Cardolan, Argeleb was recognized as the true king of all Arnor. But in Rhudaur, the Witch King ruled. And so, eventually, the combined forces of Angmar and Rhudaur declared outright war on what remained of Arnor. Now, the first named casualty of this Angmar war was poor old King Argeleb himself. And after only 7 years of rule, Argeleb was succeeded by his son, King Arveleg. And this is where things get really confusing, because pretty much every ruler of Arnor after Argeleb takes the prefix Ar at the beginning of their name, all the way down to even like Arathorn and Aragorn. So Ar simply means king in the Adonaic language of the Númenóreans, and so having it at the beginning of your name kind of denotes a person's right to rule. Which I guess is a great example of Tolkien using language to build his world, but it does mean that so many of Arnor's kings have very similar sounding names. Anyway, Arvaleg, son of Argaleb, carried on his father's legacy of resisting the Witch-king. And just as the Witch-king had made an alliance with the orcs and hillmen, Arvaleg made alliances of his own, starting with the princes of Cardolan and the elves of the Grey Havens. And together, under Arvaleg, this force was able to slow the advance of the Witch-king. But, I guess much like winter itself, the Witch-king could not be prevented entirely. So, in the year 1409, a great battle was fought atop the watchtower that will one day become known as Weathertop. The defenders were comprised of Arvaleg's men, his allies from Cardolan, and possibly, although certainly not definitely, some elves from the Grey Havens. The attackers were entirely servants of the Witch-king. And this battle was a disaster for the men of Arnor. Both King Arvaleg and the last prince of Cardolan were slain. The watchtower of Amonsul was burned and razed, and the territory of Cardolan fell to Angmar. And there's something kind of interesting here that comes full circle in The Lord of the Rings. Because we're told by Tolkien that the last prince of Cardolan was interred in a barrow down. And it's very possible that this barrow down may be the same one that Frodo and the hobbits would become trapped in over 1,500 years later. And of course, that's not the only reference to this battle that we see in The Lord of the Rings. Because Arvaleg's death upon Weathertop is eerily similar to Frodo's near-death experience in that same place. And both of these events were precipitated by the Witch-king. However, Arvaleg's death was not quite the end for Arnor. In fact, the defeat on Amonsul marked a new beginning for the Dúnedain of the North Kingdom. Because after King Arvaleg came his 18-year-old son, Arathor. And Arathor had the backing of Círdan the Shipwright, the Lord of the Grey Havens and one of my all-time favourite elves. And Arathor also had support from Elrond, who provided elven warriors from both Rivendell and Lothlorien. And so, in Arnor's new capital city, the city of Fornost, the combined armies of Arathor, Círdan, and Elrond repelled the Witch-king, and they actually utterly defeated him. And so, for the next almost 500 years, there was peace in the north. For a good few generations, everything was groovy in Arnor. But this is not the end of the video, and so I reckon you guys can guess the peace was not destined to last. You see, the Witch-king returned to his capital of Carn-Dûm, and there he began rebuilding his army. And although 5 different kings of Arthedain came and went, the Witch-king was not idle. Over the centuries, he sent evil spirits to inhabit the burial mounds of Cardolan, which were known for a time as Tirn Gorthad, although they're much better known now as the Barrow Downs. And poor old Cardolan was also ravaged by a great plague that spread from the lands east of Mordor. Its inhabitants were either struck down by sickness or assailed by the Barrow-wights, and so, eventually, just like Rhudaur before it, Cardolan fell to the power of the Witch-king without a single battle needing to be fought. Now, that's not to say there were no more battles to be fought, and the Witch King's hour of conquest finally came once again in the year 1974. So, during the reign of King Arvedui, that's the great-great-great-great-grandson of King Ara IV, Arnor's capital of Fornost once again came under attack, and this time it was conquered by the armies of Angmar. In fact, the Witch King himself took up residence in the former capital of his enemies. And sadly, this marked the point of no return for Arnor. Now, to be fair, King Arvedui did survive the fall of Fornost, the fall of his capital, and he fled with 2 Palantiri and a small group of loyal Dúnedain far up into the icy northern wastes. And there he sought shelter with the mysterious snowmen of Forochel. But he never returned. In fact, what Arvedui's name literally means is the last king. And this name turned out to be pretty spot on, because Arvedui did in fact drown in the ice bay with both of his Palantiri, far away from his beloved kingdom of Arnor. And with Arvedui's death, the line of the kings in the north failed. Now, as I'm saying all this, you may very well be wondering, well, what about Gondor? What's Gondor been up to this whole time? Why didn't their king send aid to Arnor in its time of need? Well, the answer is that at this time, Gondor was about as militarily screwed as Arnor was. It seems that Sauron kinda knew what he was doing when he sent the Witch King up north, because while Arnor was battling Angmar, Gondor was busy battling enemies of its own. Only 30 years before the fall of Fornost, Gondor had suffered a disastrous defeat at the hands of a group of Easterlings known as the Wainriders. King Onderhair of Gondor was slain, and so were both of his male heirs. And there's a fun little fact here, because King Onderhair's daughter, whose name is Firiel, she actually ended up marrying King Arvedui. And because both of Firiel's brothers were dead and her father was dead, by the law of the Dúnedain, she was the rightful ruling queen of Gondor. And of course her husband Arvedui was the king of Arnor. So, according to this ancient law of Isildur and Elendil, Arvedui believed that he had a claim to reunite the kingdoms of both Gondor and Arnor. However, unfortunately, the people of Gondor did not agree with Arvedui, and they chose their own new king called Eärnil. And thus, the 2 kingdoms remained separate. Now, I know I said that Arvedui was the last king of Arnor, but that's not because he didn't have an heir, it's more because he didn't really have a kingdom anymore. And the son of Arvedui and Firiel became the first chieftain of the Dúnedain, the first chieftain of the Rangers of the North. And about, I think it's 15 generations later, the title of chieftain is inherited by Aragorn, who is descended from the last king of Arnor and the rightful ruling queen of Gondor, and that's why Aragorn is able to reunite the 2 kingdoms and rule as the High King of all Dúnedain, just as Elendil and Isildur did thousands of years ago. But anyway, back to the Witch King. With the deaths of King Arvedui and King Onderhair, it seemed like both of the kingdoms of the Dúnedain were limping towards death's door. But it was not the end. You see, the year before Arvedui died, he sent a message to King Onderhair's successor, that new king, Eärnil. And King Eärnil promised to send a fleet of ships to help Arnor as soon as he was able. So Eärnil sent his son, Eärnur, who has another confusingly similar name to his father, to sail from Gondor to the Grey Havens in the hopes of uniting with the men of Arnor and defeating the Witch King once and for all. And the fleet of Gondor was no small force. In fact, it was pretty freaking massive. The ships of Captain Eärnur filled all 3 bays of Mithlond, that's the Grey Havens, Forlond, which is the Northern Havens, and Harlond, which is the Southern Havens. And amongst their number were Knights of Gondor and Riders of Rovanion, that's kind of the ancestors of the Riders of Rohan. And that wasn't all. Eärnur's army was bolstered by warriors of the Elven Lords Círdan, Elrond, and Glorfindel, as well as the surviving Rangers of Arnor, and we're even told that a company of Hobbit archers came to join the host of the West. So, under the command of Captain Eärnur, the son of King Eärnil, a great army set out to do battle with the Witch-king of Angmar. And, for the most part, this renewed war was a roaring success. Eärnur and his army marched through Arnor, slaying orcs and evil men wherever they could be found. But the final battle, that would once again take place in the city of Fornost, the former capital of the kings of Arthedain. And in this battle, the Witch King brought everything he had against the host of the West. But the Witch King was arrogant. Instead of remaining in Fornost and using the city's fortress-like defences against Eärnur, he marched out, and he met the army of Eärnur in open battle. And to be honest, Tolkien doesn't give us many details at all about this battle, but we do know that the forces of Angmar were utterly defeated. The Witch King rallied his servants and fled back into the north towards his fortress of Carn Dûm. But before he could get there, the Witch King was set upon by the combined cavalry of Eärnur and Glorfindel. And Tolkien tells us that after the battle, not a man nor an orc of that realm remained west of the mountains. Angmar was vanquished. But the Witch King was not. So, when all was lost for Angmar, the Witch King found Eärnur on the battlefield, and he singled him out. And he rode up to Eärnur with a great cry, and although Eärnur bravely held his ground, his horse was overcome with fear, and it fled before the Witch King, while Eärnur was helpless to stop it. And so the Witch King laughed, and he declared Eärnur a coward. And then he fled back to Mordor before Eärnur had an opportunity to prove him wrong. Now, this, sadly, is pretty much the end of Arnnor's story. But it's not the end of the Witch King's story. He returned to Sauron, and within a few years he'd reconquered Minas Ithil, that's the old city of Isildur, which was afterwards renamed Minas Morgul, the Tower of Black Sorcery. But in the north, the survivors of Arnor were simply too few and too weak to rebuild their own kingdom, and so Arnor was lost. And all that remained of the once great kingdom of Elendil were the ruins of its cities and the ranges of the north. However, back in Gondor, Captain Eärnur returned as a conquering hero. And when his father King Eärnil died, Eärnur became the new king of Gondor. But despite his success in defeating the Witch King, Eärnur would not be remembered for his military exploits. His fate, I'm afraid, was far darker. You see, just like with Arvedui, Eärnur was destined to be the final king of the Dúnedain for over 1,000 years. And just like with Arvedui, his doom came directly from the Witch King himself. So, after Eärnur's coronation, the Witch King once again challenged him. And once again he reminded Eärnur of his perceived cowardice at the Battle of Fornost. Now, Arnor was not a bad king, but he was known primarily for his military prowess, and in many ways he was more like a champion than a ruler. So when the Witch King renewed his challenge 7 years later, this was simply too much for Arnor to abide, and against the advice of literally everyone, Arnor rode off to Minas Morgul to answer the Witch King's challenge. But he never returned. Now, it's possible that Arnor knew this was going to be a one-way trip, because very interestingly, he took off his crown before departing, and he left it in the houses of the dead. And that is where the crown remained for very nearly 1,000 years, until eventually Faramir, the son of Steward Denethor, took it up once more and presented it to Aragorn for his coronation. And so, with Eärnil missing and presumed dead, the rule of Gondor passed to the stewards, and it was their charge to protect the throne until the king returns. Now, we could spend hours speculating on what actually happened to King Eärnur in Minas Morgul, but the truth is, Tolkien doesn't tell us, and I feel like at the end of the day, what more is there to be said than that the Witch King won? In only 75 years, he broke the long line of kings in both Arnor and Gondor. And then he kind of disappeared from the annals of history. I mean, he did attack Osgiliath more than once, but his next real contribution to the Third Age would not begin until the hunt for the ring almost 1,000 years later. And yet, despite the fact that the Witch King sat out most of the second half of the Third Age, his actions in Arnor forever changed the histories of the Dúnedain. More so than any other villain of the Third Age, the Witch King left a truly dark mark upon Middle-earth. But I don't want to end this video on a downer, and of course eventually the Witch King's victims will be avenged, although it happens in a fairly roundabout way. You see, way back during the reign of King Argaleb II, that's the son of Arathor, the king invited two brothers to lead their people into a protected area of his realm. And these brothers happened to be of the newly arrived race of hobbits. So, King Argaleb gave to them the green country that would go on to be known as the Shire. And for many, many years, the hobbits lived peacefully as grateful allies of the kings of Arnor. Now, about 1,000 years later and 1,000 miles away, the steward of Gondor, who was a man called Cirion, made a similar gift of land to his allies, the ones who'd helped him out in Gondor's most recent war against the Easterlings. This land in eastern Gondor was called Calenarthon, but in later years it became known as the Kingdom of Rohan. And again, for many, many years, the horsemen of Rohan lived as grateful allies alongside the rulers of Gondor. So, if we skip forward now to the Witch King's eventual end, we'll see how all these strands come together. Because the Witch King of Angmar was not killed by a knight of Gondor nor by a ranger of Arnor. Instead, he was killed by a union of one hobbit from the Shire and one shield maiden from Rohan. Simple folk from lands that were gifts of the Dúnedain ended up avenging the kings of the Dúnedain, and they concluded the reign of the Witch King once and for all. So, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, there are plenty more like it on the channel, so be sure to check them out. But until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevaeh Melanine.